Well, good morning. My name is Jonathan, and I don't know if you heard, but there was a hockey game in St. Paul last night. Maybe a few people were at that game. Congratulations, the Edina boys hockey team won the state championship last night. Yep. And the girls team won state 2 weeks ago. So congrats to both of them. Quite a year. Well, whether you're an Edina fan or not, whether you're a hockey fan or not, I really enjoyed after the game watching the celebrations, particularly of the players on the ice. As you see after that win, you just see pure joy come out. You see the love for their teammates. You see the ways that, like the release and the relief that comes from all of the hard work that they've put in and all of the things that they've gone through to get to that point. And it just, the pressure, it lifts. And it's kind of a beautiful thing to get to watch. Well, today we're gonna look at a story in the Old Testament where in the life of Elijah, he has experienced a great victory. And you might expect there to be victory laps and celebrations and the release of joy. And instead we find something quite the opposite. We find Elijah not with his teammates and other people, but we find him alone in the wilderness and really despairing of life itself. So we're gonna kind of get in the midst of that story and understand why he's in this place and how he ends up in the wilderness. Because I think as we do that, we're gonna understand God's care and his healing for us when our own journeys can feel like too much. So we're going to be in the book of 1 Kings in the Old Testament. If you want to flip in a pew Bible, we're going to be starting in chapter 17. At the end of chapter 17 on page 505, we'll eventually get to 1 Kings 19 is where we'll end up. But you got to know a little bit about what's happening to get the full picture here. So in the book of, or at this time in Kings, in this season in the life of the nation of Israel, there is a king over Israel named Ahab, and he is married to Jezebel. Now, you may not know much about this part of the Bible, but I guarantee you Ahab and Jezebel were probably not on your list of baby names if you've had a boy or a girl, right? You just know, like, one, they're maybe not your style, but two, you've heard, those are names of like bad evil people, right? And apologies if you're Ahab or Jezebel in here. Didn't hear it after the first service, just thought about that now. Well, what we see in the life of Israel is that Ahab and Jezebel, they, instead of leading the people of Israel to the worship of Yahweh, the one true God over Israel, they actually set up a religious system to worship Baal, a Canaanite fertility god. So they kind of end the worship. They shut down all of the places of worship in the country, and they instead replace it with this alternate system. And that's not a good thing if you didn't know. That's a bad thing. Well, in the midst of this evil, God calls a prophet. And this is what God does. When God's people turn from him, he calls someone who's going to speak to them and who's going to act on his behalf to call them back into his love and grace. And so Elijah goes to Ahab and he says, hey, because of the evil that you've led God's people into, there is going to be no rain in this land for multiple years. And it's an agricultural society. I mean, this is going to be devastating on what goes on in Israel. And so we pick up in 1 Kings 18, where God tells Elijah there is going to be rain again. And this is after years of drought. But before the rain comes, there's going to be a confrontation between God and between Elijah as representative of God and between the prophets of Baal. So Elijah says, hey, Ahab, we're going to set this up on Mount Carmel, and I want you to invite all of the people of Israel to witness, and at the end of the day, we're going to decide who is Israel really going to worship. Who's going to be the winner of this once and for all showdown. So it's kind of like an epic, kind of Hollywood battle scene. You've got 450 prophets of Baal on one side, all in their things and supported by the royal family, and then on the other side, you have Elijah all by himself, nobody there with him. And the way that Elijah sets this contest up is they're going to set up an altar on Mount Carmel. They're going to have a bull sacrificed, and it's really simple. you're going to pray to your God, and whichever God consumes this sacrifice with fire first, that's going to be the true God. So Elijah allows the prophets of Baal to go first, and they work themselves into a frenzy. They're chanting, they're praying, they're dancing around, they're doing all these things, and nothing happens. And in the midst of this, Elijah does the thing that I tell my kids you're not allowed to do. He taunts them and trash talks during this whole contest. And he says, well, hey, maybe your God just can't hear you. Maybe you just need to be a little bit louder. Maybe he's out running errands or doing something else. And then the Bible says, it uses the word, maybe he's busy. And what actually the Hebrew text says there is, maybe he's going to the bathroom and he can't hear you because he's in the bathroom. That's what Elijah tries to do. You can't make this stuff up. It's there. Well, guess what? After all of this, the altar is dry and untouched. And so when it's finally Elijah's turn, you've noticed he has a little flair for the dramatic. He asked them in the midst of a drought, he says, I actually want you to pour water all over this altar. And then he said, after they pour water over the altar once in the sacrifice, he says, let's do it again. And after they do it a second time, he says, let's do it one more time. And at this point, the altar is basically floating. There's a moat all around it. It is just covered in water. And at that moment, Elijah stops and he prays for God to bring fire down. And boom, fire comes down. It consumes the altar, it consumes the sacrifice, and it licks up every drop of water. So what happens when that happens? What happens next, right? So we read in 1 Kings 18, when all the people saw this, they fell prostrate and cried, the Lord, he is God. The Lord, he is God. And then Elijah commands the prophets of Baal to be seized and to be killed for being false prophets. And as if this wasn't kind of a mic drop moment enough as it is, Elijah turns to King Ahab and he says, you better get back to your palace because there is a downpour of rain coming like you've never seen before in your life. And your chariot's going to get stuck in the mud if you don't get going now. And so just like that, in one fell swoop, it seems that the battle and the war has been won by God and by Elijah in this moment. And so we would expect, again, the celebrations and parades and all of this joy, and yet here's what we get next in 1 Kings 19. Now Ahab told Jezebel everything God had done and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. And so Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah to say, may the gods deal with me, be it ever so severely, if by this time tomorrow I do not make your life like that of one of them. Jezebel used this time tomorrow a little differently than we have around CPC, if you've heard that. Elijah was afraid and ran for his life. And when he came to Beersheba in Judah, he left his servant there, while he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness. He came to a broom bush, sat down under it, and prayed that he might die. Then that he might die. I've had enough, Lord, he said. Take my life. I am no better than my ancestors. Then he lay down under the bush and fell asleep. All at once, an angel touched him and said, get up and eat. And he looked around, and there by his head was some bread baked over hot coals and a jar of water. He ate and drank and then lay down again. The angel of the Lord came back a second time and touched him and said, get up and eat, for the journey is too much for you. So he got up and ate and drank. And strengthened by that food, he traveled 40 days and 40 nights until he reached Horeb, the mountain of God. Elijah goes from this mountaintop of mountaintops to this lowest of valleys almost instantly. What's going on? Why does Elijah run to the wilderness after this decisive victory? Well, it starts with Queen Jezebel, her messenger that comes to meet Elijah after this battle. Jezebel promises she's going to hunt Elijah down and kill him. And so the obvious answer, it feels like, is, well, Elijah's in the wilderness because he's fearing for his life, right? That's what verse 3 says. But two things to note here. One is that for about the last 3 years of his life, Elijah has been on the run for his life. This is not a new thing in the life of Elijah. Ahab has wanted to kill him since well before this. So he's been running for his life. That isn't different than what it's been. But second, the other thing that we see is that Elijah doesn't go into the wilderness to protect his life, does he? And no, he says he isolates himself. He goes off on his own. And honestly, he prays. He wants his life to be over. It's not about saving or protecting his skin. So there's something more underneath the reason why Elijah is in the wilderness. I think the reason that Elijah is in the wilderness is because the math of following God is not adding up for him in this moment. It's not adding up anymore. And I know what you're thinking. You were promised no math at church, but I promised just a little bit, and there will not be a quiz at the end. But after Elijah's victory over the prophets of Baal, here's what he probably expected to happen. That Ahab and Jezebel would be defeated, and either they would be humbled in such a way as that they would turn and repent and follow God, or God would raise up a new king and leader over them. He would expect that the people would turn and now realize the errors of their ways and want to worship God. That the land which was parched and had been in famine would now be filled with crops, and the people would enjoy prosperity, and they would have economic riches because they'd have all this food to trade, and that Elijah wouldn't be running for his life anymore, that he wouldn't be alone, and he wouldn't be in the wilderness. And yet, even though Elijah followed his prophetic mission so faithfully, that's where we find him. Instead of prosperity, his circumstances are just as bad as they were before, if not worse. This is not a fear of dying, but the kind of fear that makes you want to die. This is the fear of deep discouragement. This is the fear of a crushed spirit. It's the fear that enshrouds you in a lonely moment after victory. 1 + 1 wasn't adding up to 2 anymore for Elijah. At some level, he expected if he obeyed God, then he was promised a good outcome. He was promised good circumstances. And when that doesn't come right away for him, and when that doesn't come right away for us, it reveals a deep wound in our souls. Have you been through a moment like this with God? Have you been to this wilderness before? I'm sure that there are people in this room right now who are in a place like this. Sometimes, like Elijah, success in one area of our life doesn't bring happiness in all the areas of our life. That one area of our life feels like we are at the top of the mountain. And then other things in our life make all of that feel like it's going to crash down to earth. Maybe you had a plan for your life. Maybe you had a picture for how it was going to go and what it was going to turn out like. And maybe along the way, some things didn't happen that you thought would. Maybe you didn't make the sports team that you thought you would. Maybe you didn't go to the college that you had thought all your life that you would go to. Maybe life after college has been hard and you thought you would have community and friends, and yet you feel like you're searching all over again for identity and community. Maybe family has been a place of hurt and disappointment instead of love and security. Maybe the job that you were sure that you were perfect for and was your calling said no, and that door closed. Maybe retirement hasn't been full of travel and fun, but it's been full of caretaking and health struggles. Or maybe like Elijah, you're just weary and tired right now. That the light at the end of the tunnel feels like it's not getting closer, it's getting further away. That the harder you try to do the right things, the more it feels like life is getting more difficult. These are the wilderness places that are really hard for us to go, to think about, and yet those are the real struggles of life. I read somebody who said that there have been commentators over the years who have thought that 1 Kings 19 shouldn't be in our Bibles. Like, why would this happen right after? This can't be true. And yet I have to think, if anybody has lived any amount of time on this earth, we've gone through these moments of highs and lows. And I'm so thankful that that's here, because it means that the life of faith is for all kinds of seasons of joy and seasons of wilderness. That in the midst of this, we get to see and learn from Elijah. So what do we do, as it says in verse 7, when our journey feels too much? So I think there's two things I want us to take from what we see with Elijah. The first is I want you to see how God shows gracious care for his body and soul. When Elijah prays in the wilderness that he's had enough, God doesn't say a word back. God doesn't scold him for running away and running into the desert. He doesn't give him fresh instructions. He doesn't tell him, this is the next thing that I need you to do right now. No, he allows Elijah to fall asleep under a broom bush. Now, a broom bush is a desert shrub. It's kind of like a juniper tree, is what I've read. And it's not a pretty tree. It's not one that I think you probably have in your yard. It's designed to survive in really harsh climates, and it has roots that go really deep. And what happens, though, with a broom bush is when it gets really dry, like after a drought, the needles fall, and it forms a little bed underneath it of needles. Now, this isn't going to be confused with like a Tempur-Pedic mattress, but if you think about what did Elijah need in that moment in the wilderness, he needed a soft place to lay his head. And God provides it underneath this tree. And then God also sends an angel to feed him. And I've heard pastors say that sometimes the most spiritual thing you can do is take a nap. I hope you don't take a nap now, but I can't really argue if you fall asleep right now. That rather than more Bible study, rather than another prayer meeting, that you might need a walk outside, a good meal, and a good night's sleep. That in our wilderness places, that we might be trying to solve our way out of the wilderness through every tactic that we can think of, except that we're not remembering that God has made us human beings as bodies and souls. And so therefore, maybe instead of another book or podcast to understand a struggle you're going through, maybe instead of a new life hack to fix your schedule, or maybe instead of an entertainment escape that you think will help ease your disappointments, maybe we need to listen to God's promptings in our journey, that our journey is too much, and we need to find our rest and care for our bodies in him. When we find that our journey is too much, we need to see that God is ready to meet us with his care and provision. So the second thing that I want to point out here is that God meets Elijah in the wilderness by giving him gentle reminders of his past provision for him. That often the way to move out of that disappointment of the wilderness, it starts by looking back to what's already happened. Now, if I was alone in the wilderness and all of a sudden there was someone serving me food, I would ask a few questions before I would eat anything. Like I would want to know a little bit like, what are you doing here? What is this? What are you feeding me? But actually, as part of Elijah's story, it's not that unusual that Elijah just takes and eats what the angel gives him. If you go back to 1 Kings 17, God has a habit of showing up and providing for Elijah in unexpected ways. That before, when he originally ran out into the wilderness early in his journey with running from Ahab, that God delivers food for Elijah. He says, I'm going to deliver food by ravens. Who needs DoorDash when you've got birds to deliver? And then later in the story, Elijah is sent to go get food from a widow and her son who are literally ready to die because they have the last little bit of flour and the last little bit of oil. And God miraculously sustains that supply of food to feed Elijah and her son and this widow for a lengthy season and makes way for all of them to survive this famine. As Elijah is eating this food from the angel, I wonder if it occurs to him, he's like, wow, this is so great. It just keeps happening to me. I don't know. I just keep getting food from somewhere. But I think as he sits in this in the wilderness and maybe has some time with it, I would hope and I think that you see that he begins to reflect on, God has been faithful to me throughout my journey. God has been faithful to provide in the past for his people. I think I can trust that God's going to be good to me going forward. But like Elijah, I think we all suffer from selective memory. What I mean by that is we like to rehearse the stories. We like to remember the things. Sometimes that aren't always helpful in our journey. So we rehearse the stories about how we've been wronged. We rehearse the stories about how God doesn't see what we're going through. And in the wilderness, all Elijah at this moment can see is his disappointments. He can see his failures, what hasn't happened yet, what he thinks, how he's alone in the midst of all this. And yet as he rehearses these failures and disappointments, God is prompting him with going, remember how I fed you in the past. Remember how I'm providing food for you now. Even in Israel's past, the idea of bread from heaven is what we kind of heard about last week. An angel providing cake for him. You might call it angel food cake, right? What stories, I had to do it, sorry. What stories have you been telling yourself as you walk in the wilderness? What do you remember about how God has moved in your life in the past? How might God be opening your eyes to see the ways that he's at work right now in ways that you're not able to see just quite yet? I was sharing this sermon with kind of some of the ideas this week with a friend here at CBC, and he prompted me with a quote from a mentor of his and another pastor. His name's Ben Patterson. Patterson says this: God has more for us in the waiting than in the thing we are waiting for. Now, there's a whole sermon in that sentence, right? And some of us have been living out that sentence for many years of our life. I remember a time in my life after I graduated college. I was going through a breakup. My work plans weren't coming together how I thought they should or wanted them to. My friends were moving away, and all of a sudden I wasn't a college student anymore. My life just felt different, and I wasn't quite prepared for the changes that were happening. It was a season of wilderness, but as a 22-year-old, I didn't have that language or understanding for that yet. And during this season, my prayers were for God to solve my problems. And there's nothing wrong with those kind of prayers. But that isn't what I found happening in my life. I look back on this season now with almost 20 years of hindsight, that is one of the seasons of my life where God drew closest to me. I wouldn't wish to go back there for anything, and yet I knew that God was with me and caring for me. It was a time when I experienced his presence and I received his care for me, and that has prepared me for the journey ahead. May you find the same too. So we're going to close now with a time of confession and reflection. I'm going to ask you two questions. We're just going to enter into a time of prayer, and I'll prompt you with the first question, and then I'll give you the second question here in a second. So the first question is, where do you need to confess that right now your journey feels like too much? For many of us, that can be hard to admit. It can be hard to even think about. But where are you experiencing that your journey feels too much? And then how do you today need to remember God's faithfulness to you in the past? What promises of God do you need to remember as you experience his care for you right now in whatever season of wilderness you find yourself in? God, thank you that you meet us and care for us in the wilderness.